We ended our last lesson with Philippians 2, 1 through 4. And I'm going to read that again before we read the section we're going to look at today, because I want you to have a context. If there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort provided by love, any fellowship in the Spirit, any affection or mercy, complete my joy and be of the same mind, by having the same love, being united in spirit, having one purpose. Instead of being motivated by selfish ambition or vanity, each of you should, in humility, be moved to treat one another as more important than yourself. Each of you should be concerned not only about your own interests, but about the interests of others as well. And then he will carry on by saying, you should have the same attitude or way of thinking toward one another that Christ Jesus had. And then comes our Philippians, we've called it a hymn, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But now here comes this hymn. Listen to the language. I put a handout in the group a couple of days back. I don't know who had a chance to look at it. Okay. But here is your hymn. And I'm reading a translation, not my own translation. Who, though he existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a slave, and by looking like other men, and by sharing in human nature. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. As a result, God exalted him and gave him the name that's above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. As I was preparing this talk for today and doing the reading that I've had actually time to do a lot more reading because we had the seminar and then I had to cancel last week. Trying to find an entry point into this talk seemed to be a real challenge because we have to deal with so many questions, and which types of questions we begin with are going to determine kind of the way we're going to slant our answers to other questions. So, for example, there's the question of structure, and I placed that in the handout. We're going to look at two of them, Lomair's and Jeremias's. But once you've settled the question of structure, that's going to also affect the way you're going to translate certain terms like morphe theou, form of God is form, the English term that we want to use here, or harpagmos. How do we understand harpagmos? Is it what's known as an active noun here? Is he talking about the thing grasped or the act of grasping? Which one? How do we come down on this? What does kenosis mean? What does it mean he emptied himself? We just have linguistic barriers we have to deal with because we're also looking at certain terms in this hymn that are found nowhere else in the New Testament, like harpagmos, and they're very rare in classical Greek. So you have to make decisions cautiously and carefully. We could look at backgrounds for this hymn. I mean, we'll talk about some backgrounds later, but there's Gentile, Greco-Roman mythological backgrounds, Gnostic Redeemer myth backgrounds, wisdom backgrounds in Judaism, prophetic backgrounds in Judaism. There's different background possibilities here. What are we dealing with? And then providence. Who wrote it? Did Paul write it? Okay, if Paul wrote it, then you can have certain arguments. We'll talk about that. But if Paul didn't write it, where did it come from? Did it come from Jewish Christianity? How would we know? What's the model of theology and salvation that's being described here? And if it comes from Jewish Christianity, does it come from, say, Jerusalem Jewish Christianity under James and Peter, or Hellenistic Jewish Christianity, the kind that we see with Stephen the Martyr and the Fourth Gospel communities? So all of these are questions that surround this hymn, and the answers to any one thing, excuse me, is going to determine how we're going to see this hymn. So I want to just share with you some key takeaways for me, and the first thing I need to do is to figure out how to minimize this screen. Oh, so I can get to my handout. I can't minimize Zoom Workplace when I'm recording a meeting. Okay. Word. Oh, Lord have mercy. Here we go. All right. Now, I wonder if it'll let me share my screen. I'm hoping so. Where is share screen? Share. Screen. Share. Okay, there we go. Let's open this bad boy up. I want to open you up. There we go. Minimize. Well, we can just leave ourselves here. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Nod. Okay. Now, what I did was I took I'm going to say that the most widely accepted structuring of this hymn. That's Ernst Lohmeyer, and just so many scholars follow him in this. And he discovers this in the first part half of the 20th century. So you'll notice he has 6 verses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each verse can be broken down into 3 phrases. Okay? Furthermore, there appears to be almost a chiastic structure to this with an A, B, C, C, B, A. Okay? Here, he doesn't consider equality with God to something to be grasped. Here, everybody's acknowledging that he's God. Here, he empties himself and becomes like a human. Here, it's at that human's name that every knee will bow. Here, he humbles himself to death and God exalts him. Okay, so you see that chiastic structure within that hymn that Lohmeyer and others have identified. Now, what makes a hymn a hymn? And so I believe, yes, I asked Grok to just spit me out a little essay for you. And I got to tell you something about Grok 3 here. Grok 3 knows its stuff when it comes to exegesis. It's stunning. It's amazing. And there's been a couple times where I'll be talking to Cheryl and kind of lecturing, and then I'll go ask Grok and it'll say the same points. It's like, wow. Maybe it's the algorithm trying to get to me. But at any rate, if you had a chance to read this, you will notice that poetic structure or parallel phrases or stanzas are a sign of non-prose. Now, whether we're dealing with something that is sung, a hymn, or a poem, there could be discussion about. But because of the Christological nature of it, there are others and myself that would suspect this is actually something that is sung. There's a rhythmic or elevated style. This is especially true in the Greek text. There's a focus on Christology. There's vocabulary or liturgical terms used, like humneo, hado, doxa, and eulogitos. But notice these aren't always present. Like 1 Timothy 3:16, it's confessedly. I mean, it's the verb there is to confess. So he's indicating a confession of faith. You have quotations or contextual clauses like where Paul is telling the Corinthians that which was handed unto him, he's just passing on to them that. Christ died according to the scriptures. Christ, was buried, raised from the dead according to the scriptures. And then also unusual vocabulary or syntax. Um, and for example, where you start with a Haas, which is who, which is how our text begins. Haas, who. In other words, the original hymn would have the name of Jesus or Christ. Jesus Christ, though he existed in the form of God, but when Paul quotes it, he connects the paragraphs with the relative pronoun. And so you have other examples and indications of what constitutes or what makes a hymn. Now, Jeremias came along and made the case that what we're dealing with here is parallelism, and like we find all over the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible prefers parallelism to any other sort of style of writing. And so you can have A, B, B, A, B, B, A, B, A, B. I mean, you find this all over, but look at the Psalms, for example. And it's all about parallelism. And so you will say something in a clause, and you'll repeat it with different language in the second clause. And that appears to be how Jeremias is reading this. So when we read this from Jeremias's perspective, the B clauses interpret the A clauses. What does it mean to be in the form of God? It means you don't consider grasping to consist of that which makes you equal with God. What does it mean to empty yourself? It means to take the form of a servant. What does oh my gosh, I duplicated that. ABC emptied himself. My bad. I really did bad on that. I duplicated that. He humbles himself how? By becoming obedient to death. God exalts him how? Giving him the name above all names. So each subsequent clause in the parallelism interprets the first clause. Now, one of the things about this structure is, and it can feel almost misleading, is that you're dealing with the pre-existence of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and then the exaltation of Jesus. What's missing here is reference to the resurrection. Paul always and everywhere consistently using the verb egeiro talks about the resurrection. Jesus is raised from the dead. Here, you go from cross to sitting at the right hand of God. Without that big emphasis there on the resurrection. Here, that's not an issue. I gotta get rid of this. That's just terrible. Here, that's not an issue. Now, what's really interesting is that you can take the Greek text of this hymn and you can reconvert it into Aramaic. I mean, it's easy enough that they've done it. The scholars have done it. There's your hymn in Aramaic. You know, it's not something you have to work hard at to get it back into Aramaic. And so we have the issue of structure, and now we're going to move into the issue of language. With regard, I'm going to unstop share here, okay, because we don't need this. With regard to language, yes, it's written in Greek. Now, Greek poetry depends upon the length of syllables. It can use alliteration, like words that start with a P or an R. Hebrews is very fond of that. And there are other indications that you're looking at something that's not prose. So what I'd like to do now is just look at some of the key terms in this before we come back to trying to put it all together and interpret it. And the first key term I want to look at is morphe. In the morphe, or the form of God. Now, we have to keep in the back of our minds that whatever this morphe is, it's not something to be grasped or to okay, if you're going to take the harpagmos one way, or it's not to be considered as the act of grasping if you're going to take it another way. So morphe and harpagmos both have to be defined, and they're defined in relation to each other almost automatically in the form of God. Morphe in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, is often used in parallelism with two nouns in particular, icon, which we get the word icon from. It means image. Human is made in the icon theou, the image of God. And the second is doxa, glory. The glory is the manifestation or the icon, the image of God. And the writer of the fourth gospel picks up on doxa. Paul often uses icon, but here you have a use of morphe. And so the first question is why? Why morphe? And when we see that the verb is used again down in, it's verse 7, the next verse, taking on the form of a slave, we now have something that we can use to compare how the writer's understanding the use of the word morphe. So keep all of this in mind, because the hymn appears to be saying something quite substantive about Jesus, but the question is equality with God something Jesus does not have and could have by grasping or taking it? Or is it something he already has? Does the hymn give us any particular clue? This is where harpagmos comes in. The noun that you find who in the form of God uh, did not regard equality with God, harpagmos. If you take harpagmos to be the object which is grasped, the conclusion you're going to draw is that Jesus did not have equality with God. He could grasp it, he could take it, it could be his if he wanted, but he wasn't. That's how an Arian might interpret the text. You see how early Arians could come to a text like this and read it that way? You see? Jesus wasn't God, he became God. On the other hand, harpagmos can also be translated as the act of grasping. And it's a difference between nouns that end in ma, like harpagma, and mos, mu omega sigma, harpagmos. Nouns that end in ma tend to describe a state or a condition, whereas nouns that end in mos tend to describe a process. It's the difference in Latin between res rapta and res rapienda, and it's important. Is there a way out of this? How could we say that we think we are going to find a way out so we can know why this hymn is being cited at this juncture? The first thing that we can do is think in terms of backgrounds. Backgrounds here would include the Genesis story and the suffering servant. Now, the Genesis story is certainly alluded to that Jesus was in the morphe theou. Any Greek reader is going to hear also Genesis 1:26. Let us make the human in our icon and in our homeotate, our likeness. Um, if the Adam text is what is in mind here, and if Jesus is recapitulating Adam, is that a theme that we're familiar with from the New Testament? Yes. Romans 5, Christ Adam typology. 1 Corinthians 15, Christ is the second Adam. If that kind of logic is behind this hymn, then the story of the Adam who considers equality with God to consist in snatching, grasping, taking, brings us down on the side of res rapienda, which brings us down on the side of Jesus did not consider equality with God to consist in the act of taking. Now, there's something else that becomes very profound if we take it this way. Jesus does not look at God as a taker, and therefore doesn't can see equality with God to consist of taking. Had the Son perceived the Father to be a taker, the imitation would have been akin to that of the Adam. He would have taken. Are you following me on the logic here? Can I get any head nods or anything? Okay, good. So the Adam story, the linguistics, and then perhaps most important is a larger cover, this anthropological reading that we already know from the Genesis story, the dynamics there, allows us, I think, to consider that what Paul is doing is he's taking, or Paul, the hymn writer, is taking this first Adam story and reconfiguring it in that familiar U-shaped salvation curve. Jesus was sent from heaven, came to earth, died, was raised again, and ascended to heaven. That's the pattern of salvation that you see all over the New Testament. The Father sends the Son into the world, and the Son dies, is raised, and goes to heaven. All of this is that U-shaped pattern. That's precisely what's here in that hymn. That's precisely what's there in the early sermons of the book of Acts. God sent Jesus, anointed him. He did all these things amongst you. You killed him. God raised him from the dead and set him at the right hand. It's that U-shaped pattern. 1 second, please. So if we are looking at a hymn that is thinking in terms of the true human, that Jesus is this true human, unlike Adam, who is disobedient, Jesus is obedient. They both end up in death, interestingly enough, but for different reasons and under different circumstances. And whereas Adam is disgraced and exiled, Jesus is highly exalted. Are we looking at a reversal of that Adam story? And if so, are we doing it particularly in light of the servant of Isaiah, who emptied himself, or as the Septuagint puts it, poured out his soul unto death? And Jeremias and a few others have made the case that to empty oneself is an adequate translation of the Hebrew text, where the Septuagint would have pour one's soul out to death. Okay, are we looking at Isaiah 53 here? Well, he does take the form of a slave, and the character in Isaiah 53 is a slave. Is this hymn connecting two very distinct figures? One, the suffering servant, and two, the Son of Man, the true Adam. And if that's the case, it wasn't the writer that made that connection, it was Jesus, who connects the Son of Man with the suffering servant. That takes place in Jesus' ministry. That's a hermeneutic that I think is getting played out here in this hymn. This is not something the early church sat and said, oh, let's do theology. No, they would have thought about how Jesus would have brought together the suffering servant with the Son of Man, if the Son of Man is to be translated as true human, which you know I made a case for in my book, The Jesus-Driven Life. If this is the dynamic here, then what Paul's giving us is a model of what it means to be human, truly human, in relation to each other. That's what he's doing. And he's doing it here in this context in the Philippians letter in order to show the Philippians this model of discipleship. How can they learn to esteem each other highly? How can they learn to love one another? How can they learn to think of the same mind? How can they find unity? The how is answered in the hymn, and the hymn gives you the model, and it's a step by step model for essentially I want to say a new mimesis, but it's I'm careful of using the word mimesis because it's got so much baggage loaded with it that's negative. But I would want to say a new mimesis. So let's look at this. Who, though he existed in the form of God, did not consider being equal with God to consist in the act of grasping or taking. That's not what it means to be God. What does it mean? It means emptying oneself, letting go of everything, prestige, rights, privileges, agendas, dreams, wishes, and becoming obedient unto death. Now, by the way, there's a certain logic here that one also finds in the writer to the Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 5 and following, where the writer says, therefore, when Christ came into the world, he said, and then the writer puts Psalm 40 on the lips of the pre-incarnate Christ, who says, you didn't want sacrifice and offering. You prepared a body for me. Lo, I've come to do your will, O God. There's that theme of obedience of the Son to the Father, just as there is right here. Somehow the early Christians understood that not only did the Father send the Son, but what the Son was doing in his life, in his mission, in his death, was sheer obedience to the Father. All of it. Okay, so you don't grasp, you don't take your rights, your privileges, you don't you let it go. You have to, you don't, because you're not taking, you're not even letting go. I guess that would be a bit of a Zen koan, but you're not hanging on to those things. Instead, you are surrendering everything. You're letting go. You're emptying yourself to the utter limit. Whatever that utter limit is in the situation you're in, you empty yourself all the way to that utter limit. And you do it for the benefit of the other. That's what Jesus does on the cross. He empties himself of, as the hymn writer put it, he emptied himself of all but love and bled for Adam's helpless race. This is where the hymn is moving toward. So look, when you get to a text like this, you're probably going to read writers that are going to have you back in the 19th century and all the kenosis debates. What did he empty himself of? Well, his omniscience, his omnipotence, what did he keep? Well, his humanness, I mean, they start thinking metaphysically or in terms of faculty psychology at this point, and all they're going to do is gum everything up. It's not about what he emptied himself of. It's about how and why he's self-emptying, because he is now going to be the icon, the morphe, the imago Dei. He's the image of God. He's the form of God, precisely in this self-emptying. This is the character of God. Is the divinity is self-emptying. Okay, he can move on. It goes even further. This Jesus Christ takes two forms. The first is that he takes the form of a slave. Remember who Paul is writing to. Philippi. It's a Roman colony. We talked some about this, the sociographics of Philippi, and the certain percentage that would be slave and the certain percentage that would be elite that lived here, and the function of Roman law within Philippi. Okay, when Paul uses the word slave, he's talking about a person that has no rights. They're not considered human. Just like when we drafted the United States Constitution, we said that non-white people were only three-fifths humans. You know, blacks were only three-fifths human. That way they couldn't vote because you have to be fully human to vote, right? Um, he's a slave. He has no right. He has nothing. Nothing. The only thing that a slave has is the will of the master. There is nothing else. There is only the will of the master. That's all that counts for a slave. So in this case, as we start considering and thinking back through texts like Isaiah 53 and Jesus' use of Isaiah 53, as well as his use of the Son of Man as this figure from heaven, this true human, okay, bringing them together, this hymn then is descriptive of that process of what happens when these two are brought together in that U-shaped salvific pattern. So he continues, not only is this Jesus, first of all, even though he's God, he doesn't consider the act of grasping to be a divine thing. He empties himself of everything, takes on the form of a slave, and then is found in schemati as a human, as a man. This the Greek phrase there, eurathes hos, is very awkward in Greek. You wouldn't you normally find eurisko used as a passive like this at all. So it's an indication of a Semitism and perhaps a Semitic original. Okay, now verse 8. He humbled himself. How did he humble himself? He humbled himself to the point of death. And then you have the phrase across death. Thanatu, that's staru. Cross death. It's inserted there. It breaks the pattern up entirely, which has led most writers who see this as a hymn, this particular phrase, cross death, is Paul's little addition to it. It's like he's putting exclamation points on the type of death that this slave died. Because for Paul, it's not just about, I would say for Paul, it's not just about Jesus dying. It's about dying the most outcast, malevolent type death you could die in the Roman Empire. The verb to crucify in Latin wasn't even allowed on Roman lips. It was kind of like the N word, you know. You didn't even say it. You didn't let that, if you were a Roman citizen, that word did not pass your lips. It was, that's what the soldiers did over there to the bad people. So the phrase cross death might put a real point on this hymn, because it's now at the very bottom of the hymn. We start out with this figure that's en morphe theou, and we end up with this outcast. You see that? That's a huge, huge leap, huge gulf. But it's going to get completely reversed, where this figure who dies this cross death is hooper hoopsaod. This is a rare term in the New Testament. You don't find it. Not just exalted, but like, supremely exalted, super duper exalted. It's there's a real emphasis in the preposition here. And how is he going to be hyper exalted? You'll notice that Paul says that God will, or graced, gave, charis, charizo, God graced to him the name over every single name. Now, if this is a Jewish background, which obviously we think it is, we're dealing with the name, which is YHWH. So we don't say that. We say Hashem, like the Jews, the name. To be given the name above all names is to be given those letters, and that means something. It means that one is indeed morphe theou. in the form of God. And furthermore, to be in the form of God is also going to include something else. Paul is writing to a Roman colony while he's in Roman custody as a Roman prisoner of the Roman Praetorian Guard there in that local city. And he says that the name that is given to Jesus is so far above every other name that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Caesar. That's kurios. Kurios translates YHWH in the Septuagint. Theos translates EL, but YHWH is kurios. Paul is saying something very powerful and very political here, and that's that Jesus is not only God, but Jesus is Caesar. Jesus is Lord of everything. And the everything in our hymn is threefold: above the earth, on the earth, and below the earth. And by the way, this is the only time in the New Testament you have that tripartite division. Heaven up here, earth here, and hell below. Okay? It's the only time in the New Testament. It's not, I don't think, such a significant part of the worldview of the New Testament, but you do have it here as a way of describing that there is nothing outside of the reign of God in Christ. So this hymn then for Paul and for his Philippian congregations is the way they are to behave toward each other. Now, what I just did was combine two different interpretations of this hymn. There's the soteriological interpretation, which says, that it's a more of a metaphysical reading. Jesus was God, and he came down and he died and paid for our sins, and God raised him. And okay. And then there's the ethical reading, which says, no, we reject that. It's really about, this ethic. I think they're the one and the same thing. I think in Paul's worldview, the path of discipleship, that ethic, is salvation. And salvation is what's getting created in us as we follow this path of discipleship. And he's going to say so precisely in the next verse 2, chapter 12. So then, my dear friends, just as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence, continue working out your salvation with fear and trembling. This salvation that's being worked out is not some kind of end time security of the soul thing. No, it has precisely to do with the dilemma the Philippians are in, with the opponents that they're in, and in the relations to one another. That's where the salvation is being worked out. And it's to be done with fear and trembling because they can't control results. So when Paul says work out your salvation with fear and trembling, he's not saying you can lose your salvation. No, that's not, the text isn't even thinking that way. The point I'm trying to make here is that this soteriology, this message of the gospel, this U-shaped curve, is also for us a pattern of how we live with each other. And I've been trying to stress that over and over and over again for 4 years. You can't, theology and ethics belong together, but they don't belong together like gospel and law. Okay? The ethic of the Christian life is the outworking of the behavior and character of God in our lives. That's the gospel. That's salvation. So a text like this, it gives us plenty of room to really maneuver as we're going to work now with what's happening in the Philippian congregation. These are people that are in mimetic entanglements because they're considering equality with each other. That's your rivalry process. Is in the need of one-upmanship. I'm a little better than this one because. And Paul's saying, no, 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 no. When we're in relationships, rivalry is not workable because it only escalates out of control, as in the Adam narrative. Rather, we cease being rivals. We cease to be a rival. We won't take the other as our model obstacle, and we will serve them as a servant serves. That's what Paul is saying. You care for each other as though you're the slave of everybody that's in the room with you there in that congregation. You're the slave. And if everybody has that mindset, everybody will be taken care of. And that's the church. But it's only if the whole congregation adopts this way of thinking, and you can adopt that way of thinking, especially if you're singing about it together and learning about it together. So that's going to be my primary take here on the Philippians chapter 2, 5 through 11 hymn. Please do feel free to unmute yourselves and we can have a talk.
Um, do you find it at all? Can you expand a little on your observation that there's no reference to the resurrection in the hymn? Is that for you evidence that Paul probably did not himself write the hymn, that it probably
That
came from
would be
somewhere
that
else?
would be a piece of indirect evidence.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Hmm.
Paul almost always follows crucifixion with resurrection.
Hmm.
Almost, and yeah.
Hmm. And you seem to lean toward a preference for, in terms of the debates around the background. You seem to be leaning toward a preference for the scholarly notion that it had a Jewish background.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
correct? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's not a Gnostic Redeemer myth.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, no.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, that
Mhm.
presupposes way too much, including the full-blown development of Gnosticism around 50 CE, which is impossible.
Right, right. Okay. And yet at the same time, at the end, you said that the uh the the tension between the Adam story as background and the suffering servant as background um is to some extent a non-question because theology and ethics belong together. Can you expand on that a little bit, if I understood you correctly?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would put the two figure. Well, you maybe so, because theology would have to do with being made in the image of God, but the servant of Isaiah would be how that image behaves.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Christian theology has separated ethics from doctrine forever. I mean, going back forever.
Hmm.
And it's especially true in Protestantism.
Hmm.
Protestants just don't know how to handle the category of law.
Hmm.
And the Catholic Church has the rubric of natural theology, which allows them to do all kinds of strange things with what they perceive to be laws of nature.
Hmm.
Um, but it's this disjunction that is keenly, keenly felt. And this is especially true in Orthodoxy. You notice that Orthodoxy, you don't won't find a book on ethics anywhere. It's all theology and liturgy and other things, but Orthodoxy don't do ethics. They can't. It's impossible because they've got a Gnostic worldview that's so hyper-Athanasian, it's almost Apollinarian. Jesus is just divine. His kingdom is out there. It's beyond. Um, it's uh, it's this separation, this disjunction between theology and ethics that has bothered me most of my life. I could never make the two meet. It really until recently, until the last 4 or 5 years, when I began to see that the message of the gospel, which is about the character of God, is also the message of discipleship, which is the character of God being formed in us, the formation of our souls into the Father's image. And so theology and ethics are really the same thing. We're living out our hermeneutic. The doctrine of the Trinity is our hermeneutic. Living it out means living it out in this kind of self-giving love that the New Testament bears witness to on every single page. Well, except for Jude, maybe Revelation,
Mhm.
you know. Um, I mean, Bart was never able to solve that problem. Bless his heart, Steve. And
Bless his heart. Bless him.
so, and that
Bless
was
his
one of
heart.
Bonhoeffer's grievances with Bart was he said Bart can't give us any concrete guidance at all, and he couldn't. Um, I don't think Bart had ever taken it quite this far. I don't think he had an anthropology. That's the problem. Then that to me is I'm really very fortunate and blessed to have been part of the larger mimetic movement as you have, Andrew. I mean,
Mhm. Mhm.
to have had that saturate in our bones for the last 30, 40 years is it's pretty amazing.
Mhm.
I have a question slash comment if Anthony's done.
Andrew,
Um,
not Anthony.
uh,
Anthony, I'm always confused with Anthony. I wish I
Sorry.
was Anthony
That's what I
Bartlett,
thought
but
oh,
too.
I'm
sorry.
sorry I'm not. I'd be much more proud of myself if I were. But anyway,
Wrong A. Sorry.
it's
Uh,
okay.
I had a question. It is my understanding, could be wrong, that the Jewish community in Philippi was pretty small. That they really didn't even have a synagogue. If this has Jewish roots, would that imply like a pretty strong line of continuity from wherever to be, that this hymn would take root in a predominantly Gentile uh, city slash congregation with all this kind of Jewish interpretive background that goes with it. And I'm not saying that what you said was wrong. I'm just wondering about it actually giving weight to the fact that like this is really solid. I mean, this has made its way consistently through many hands or many people to this congregation uh, in Philippi.
So let me really jump into something very, very speculative. Please understand this next piece is hyper speculative, but it'll allow us to frame a conversation. Um, there are certain small elements in this hymn. I'd have to go back to the books I was looking at when I went off on a rabbit trail this week that argued that uh, a potential author for a hymn like this is Stephen, and they were noting certain
Mm,
parallels in the hymn to Stephen's
mm,
speech. Okay.
mm, mm.
Now, they're not convincing by any stretch of the imagination. I asked Google, I grokked it, you know, good, what's the evidence Stephen was the author of this hymn, and the grok is great, gives you just the same stuff I've been reading, and this is, but it's all speculative, da 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 da. At least
Mhm.
grok can let you know that. But let's say that what we're dealing with here is a hymn that comes out of that Hellenistic Jewish Christian group, which is a substantive group in the city of Jerusalem that is not under the control of James and Peter.
Well, you just read my mind because
Okay.
that's exactly where I was going. Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so we have this community. And by the way, it's that
Mm,
community that the Johannine community will be connected to before it moves to Ephesus. It's
hmm
that community that is the synagogue of the freedmen. It's that community which reads the Septuagint. It's that community
mm,
which is Samaritan friendly.
mm, hmm
Okay. So there's a lot
hmm
of connections to be made in this
hmm
particular community. Now, let's say that the writers who recognize some connections here in the way the hymn is both framed in some of the language, let's say that it comes out of Jewish, Hellenistic Jewish, Greek speaking Christianity there in Jerusalem, comes out of that group of churches, right? Those communities. Um, and they're affiliated with Stephen, right? He's part of that. He's a leader in that until he's killed.
Hmm.
Um, let's just, for argument's sake, say that as Paul is passing on in his churches a liturgical tradition for when they gather, he's going to give them
Hmm.
a liturgical tradition.
Hmm.
You know, there are going to be offices in the church, people who have roles to play in the midst of congregational life. I mean, it's structured. He's not just bringing words, he's bringing a new way of living.
Hmm.
Now, if we can have grant that that's being passed on along with the Didache, along with the, stories and everything else, then we could also say that hymns would be passed along,
Hmm.
song, okay? And there are fragments of songs in the New Testament, as we know. If I was to credit Paul with actually writing one, it would be Ephesians 1, 3 to 14. I would
Hmm.
say that would be Paul's hymn, you know. But uh, but with regard to ours, seeing that being brought to Philippi, they've learned this hymn, right? And so when Paul quotes it to them, it'd be like you or I writing a letter and breaking out into a verse or two of Amazing Grace. We can presuppose a common
Hmm.
background here.
Hmm.
Now, here's where it gets really speculative in for me, and that's that if Paul, maybe not the Philippian congregation, but if Paul knows the origin of this hymn to be in Stephen's community, it makes it even more powerful that in the next chapter when he says, "You guys want to know about zeal? I persecuted the church."
Wow, yeah, that's an interesting. Well, that's a great speculation, though.
It
That's
is it
that's
is an
nice.
interesting
That's
speculation, isn't it?
nice. Yeah, that's nice.
It's speculative. It's speculative. But it certainly helps understand that emphasis there on zeal and persecuting the church. Now I don't know. I ran it by my beloved comrade and partner in crime here, Cheryl, for a little bit, and we both agreed, man, it's pretty dubious. But it would be the community that I think that a hymn like this would have come out of. And what's really intriguing is the fact that it's so easy to render back into Aramaic uh, might indicate that we're dealing
Hmm. Hmm.
with something that comes out of the James Peter community who are
Hmm.
Aramaic speaking, and it's
Hmm.
taken over into the
Hmm.
Hellenistic
Hmm.
community very early on. It would have to be very early on,
Hmm. Has to
you
be
know.
early.
So I don't know, maybe it was like the Jesus movement and they just all wrote a lot of songs,
Hmm.
like we used to do back in the day.
Well, as you were speaking today, I mean, you just did a marvelous job as you always do. It just leaves me. I think sometimes some of us don't have much to say because we're just kind of overwhelmed. And I was thinking, okay, I'm a basically illiterate Gentile in Philippi in 60 AD, and I just heard this. How would it how would it have hit me? And it led me to there had to be some sort of continuity, embedding of something
Hmm.
for the impact. Otherwise, it would have been just jibber jabber. They would have had no context for it. But if what
Yeah.
we're talking about here, what you just presented, you know, man, this is just mind-blowingly powerful. And if I was in a congregation, uh, man,
Now you asked about
yeah,
Judaism in Philippi. There is no
yeah,
archaeological evidence yet of a synagogue there. And
right,
the Jewish presence that we have there is small.
right,
Um, What was the important piece I was going to tell you about this? Um, oh gosh, it's going to come to me in a moment. The Jewish presence there was small. There's no archaeological evidence for a synagogue. You notice Paul does not quote the scriptures in this letter.
Right. That's interesting too. Exactly
Yeah.
some of my
So,
meditations. Yeah.
so he's not even presupposing knowledge of the scriptures in this letter.
Which to me would be again, he is quoting a tradition. There's been something that's been passed down, that's been sung, it's been repeated, it's been
Right.
stamped on the inside of their retinas.
Right.
So that your analogy with Amazing Grace is exactly what I'm trying to get at. Because I was just trying to say, what's the connection? Why would this connect with that congregation? And I think you've given some really great reasons why and how, which I appreciate. Thank you for that.
Yeah, yeah. My goal was to take away any possible justification for reading a hymn like this in terms of metaphysics.
Yeah.
I think that is just completely missing the point of the hymn.
I'm dominating a little bit here today, like I sometimes do. But I don't get on Facebook a lot. I've made a choice not to. It's not good for my soul. But gosh, there's a lot of jibber jabber on canonic stuff on Facebook that I think is just a complete waste of time.
Absolutely.
Uh, Hyper speculative jibber jabber for people who don't know what the blank they're talking about. So I was really glad to hear you bring that up. There's the whole futile and useless debates on canonic this and canonic that, and it's like, but it's that ethicless, speculative. It's for me. I just have no use for it. I feel sorry for the folks that are wasting their time writing all that stuff.
It's like almost every theological debate out there. If you ask the wrong questions, you're just going to get all the wrong answers and waste your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you for letting me have some space today. Thank
Oh,
you.
yeah, Steve, you betcha.
I wasn't quite sure. I tried to pick up, but in the question of the difference between harpagmos, that word,
Mhm.
it's something that could be grasped that Jesus does not have, or something Jesus already has but chooses not to grasp. First, I was just
There's those two meanings, and then there's a third one, which is
okay,
to consist in the act of grasping.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Where do you come down there?
That
And
it's
can you
that
just expand on
it's
that
a
a little bit more?
Yeah, so I come down on the side of the fact that I'm dealing with a noun that's describing a process, not a
Hmm,
state.
okay.
And I was really lazy. I was in the living room, and I'm knowledgeable enough to remember there are significant differences in noun endings, and so instead of getting up and coming and grabbing a grammar or two off the bookshelf, which I would have done prior to Grok, I just said to Grok 3, what's the difference between Koine nouns that end in ma and Koine nouns that end in mas? And I got spit out, and I went and double checked it with three grammars, and it's almost like out of those grammars.
Hmm, hmm.
Just so by the way, if you ever want help to exegeting a Greek text, just ask Grok 3. It's really helpful. Amazingly. I can't, it's terrible to speak like this of AI, but totally impressed me. Um, Harpag nouns that end in ma are describing the object or the finished state of something. Pragma, practice. The okay, whereas pragmos would be the act of practicing. So it's the difference in Greek is viewing it between, say, an aorist and a present tense in a way, punctiliar or linear. By assuming that the mas noun is picture rather than harpagma, that harpagmos is picked on purpose, the writer, I think, is in a sense referencing the Adam story. I mean, you could do it with harpagma too, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, the apple, so to speak. But it's to consist in the act of grasping. And the one thing that you can do with the syntax of the Greek text here that I think is really, really important is you can say, who though he existed in the form of God, he did not consider it to be God as one who consists in the act of grasping. In other words, he doesn't see God as a grasper, so he doesn't grasp. And you can read it that way. You with me? So there's that implicit imitation, but there's also another implicit implication that God is not a grasping God. And I think that's really important, you know. I think a text like this has real profound implications for Christians today who are, particularly in the United States, are insisting on their rights. We have a right to this and a right to that and a right to that. And the thing is that if we're following Jesus, we have no rights. We are a slave. And Paul will say we're a slave to either master sin or master Jesus. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts, or no in betweens. You are either a slave to sin, which is your master, or you are a slave to Jesus, but you are not free. You're not some enlightenment independent island in the middle of an ocean. It challenges us on a lot, it challenges me on a lot of levels, you know.
Yeah, rights, I guess, would where they come out of natural law
Yeah, rights,
ultimately.
all your rights are going to come out of natural
Come out of
law
natural law, right?
or belief in a book that was dropped from heaven and
Right,
so we have divine command.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. But slaves have no rights. That's just important. And if you're willing to go all the way and be a slave, God will take you all the other way so you can be a Caesar. But you can't be the one without having been through the other. Or in mimetic theory, we might say the only way to become a Caesar is through bloodshed, either you shedding the blood of others or having your own shed.
Mhm, mhm. What about the emptying? I mean, when we see that self-emptying kenosis, you do kind of want a picture, you want a picture of, I don't know, a bottle of liquid being poured out or a bowl of rice being emptied or,
And so
a
can I,
vessel with
that's what
container.
kanao. That's kanao. The verb is used that way all the
Mhm,
time of
mhm,
emptying a container of its contents, right?
mhm, mhm.
Um,
But
but keno
when you alluded to the 19th century debates about
is
what is it
attributes.
that's being emptied, the
Yeah.
attributes and so on, you sounded a little impatient. So how would you read that? Like
I
what
would
is
say
the content that is being
the early
emptied?
church they weren't even thinking in those terms.
Right, right.
Okay.
No, I get that
If we if
omnipotence and so on, you're not interested in that, but
and
what
if we
what would you see being emptied?
well, if we follow the structure that Jeremias has laid out, where the second member tells you what the first member means, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. So rather than grasping divinity, he chooses to be the servant.
Mhm.
That's the emptying. The emptying ends up in a role. It's not about what he empties himself of. He in a, it's he empties himself of the need to grasp onto whatever it means to be God,
Okay.
and instead becomes the lowest of servants.
Empties himself of a will to power,
I'm going to say it's the will to love.
the will to love.
The will to love.
But you wouldn't want to empty yourself of the will to love. Wouldn't you want to be
Oh, oh, oh,
full?
oh, empty yourself of the will to power. I thought you were
Right,
saying,
right.
was this the will to
No,
power?
no, no, no.
No,
You're
no,
emptying
no,
yourself of
yes.
the will.
You absolutely are emptying
Yeah, yeah,
yourself of the
yeah.
will to power. That's exactly
Good.
right, Andrew.
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
That's
good.
exactly right.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. I
Yeah,
just wanted you to kind of put some content there because, I mean, I think it's excellent that, you're moving away from the metaphysical, uh, what's being contained is some cabinet full of metaphysical attributes. I get
right.
that. I just wanted something to hang on to is
Oh, sure, sure. So this is the will to love.
yeah, will to love instead of the will to power. Yeah. Mhm. Okay. Thanks.
For me too, again, in a historical, social context, makes the gospel more stunningly amazing. Because, guys, who in their right mind and at that time period would be interested in a message like this? I mean, who would who would buy into this? Because it would be so countercultural, so counter human nature. The fact that the church grew and expanded, it's miraculous. It's stunning. It makes me meditate on the mystery of God at work in the earth, because there's no reason in the world why any Roman citizen would sit in a meeting and listen to any of this, short of the calling of the Father upon their life and the grace of God. This would not be a message that's going to build you a crowd because it's so naturally attractive.
Don't tell Joel Osteen.
Yeah, you just beat me to the punchline. But I mean, to stand in awe of it, to stand in awe of the message, to stand in awe of the method, to stand in awe of the history that this even happened. It's like, what on earth in heaven was going on that would motivate these folks to give up everything, even perhaps their lives, to embrace this message? There had to be something so substantively tangible. We're back to ethics and things observed rather than metaphysics. And way, way, way back, I hijacked some stuff from an old Christian history magazine.
Uh,
The seven top things that attracted pagans to the church. And it was one of the crises in my life because the stuff that we were doing, none of them were in the top seven list. None of them mattered. And we got a lot of comment at the time on that. But it's just the whole thing stunning to me.
yeah, for sure.
After 2,000 years of Christian domestication, I think we lose the not just the social political challenge, but just the existential human challenge of embracing this message. It's been so culturally, uh, you know, amorphously adapted to ourselves that we lose how radical this thing is for the human experience.
Oh, I'm just thinking, here's a hymn that the congregation, sings frequently enough that it's memorized. And it's the story of salvation, in kind of very nutshell form, as, following that
Mm-hmm.
pre-existence, incarnation, death, ascension pattern. It's that story. But at the very exact same time, it's the path of our discipleship and how to do it. It's our how to. It's very practical in that sense.
And if Caesar had spies roaming the streets, and it's my understanding that he did, passing by, overhearing conversations, this is life and death stuff. You blab this to the wrong person, and you're toast, baby. If one of his spies hears this, you're going to be joining the crowd in the prison.
Well, and one does wonder though about Paul's guard.
Mm. Interesting.
you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, what were the rules around sending letters if you were a prisoner? I mean, were you always
Oh, I
permitted to
have
send
no idea.
letters?
I've
Okay,
never tried to research that.
right,
I've
right.
thought about it. My best
Mm,
guess is you'd smuggle him in and out of prison just like
okay.
Bonhoeffer
Mm,
did.
hmm hmm
He had a guard that was friendly with the family, and so
Right,
that guard smuggled stuff. I imagine it'd be the same thing here,
right, right. So
especially the praetorian if the guard he was converted.
mm, he'd have to have somebody on the quote unquote outside helping him out to get the
Yeah,
letter
oh
out
yeah.
at all, right?
Oh yeah, sure.
I just remembered I had one more technical question, Michael, if it's okay if you still have time. It's not in the hymn itself. It's verse 4. My NRSV reads, "Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others." And I noticed even the first week when we went through when you read your own translation, yours was slightly different. I think it read roughly not only your own interests, but also to the interests of others. And I made a note of that because there is something at stake there. So let each of you look not to your own interests is a little bit more radical in terms of canceling out any any space for
Yeah, yeah,
self-love, as it
yeah.
were,
So
so that so that true self-love is always looking to the interests of others first. So that in pop jargon today we hear, oh, you've got to be able to love yourself before you can love others, that kind of thing. That kind of creeps in here as a consideration. But what can you comment on the Greek there, and what the choices are that translators have to make?
Well, so you have meta auton, hekastos, skopuntes. Skopuntes is the participle of to consider. Me is your negative. Ta goes with your ekastos. Now, ta is plural. Hekastos is singular. Okay. And so the ta probably goes with the auton, which is genitive plural. Those things of yourself, not those things of yourselves alone, hekastos, are you to look after. It's the hekastos that's given you that we would translate in English as only. So don't look only to your own interests. In other words, you're going to have your own interests,
Okay.
but look to the interests of others. So he's
Yeah.
not saying don't have your own interests, look
Okay.
for other people's interests.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
Paul's not a flaming liberal.
Okay.
Did I say that?
Yes, you did. You
Uh,
naughty boy.
A better way, the hekastos, a good way to translate it would be don't look solely to your own interests, you know, but look for the interests of others.
Thanks.
Yeah.
In
Well,
the
thanks.
total, oh, okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Steve.
No, I'm sorry, I'm doing a lot today, but in the totally useless speculation category, would it be too much to say to think of any connection between Paul and Silas singing in the Philippian jail, in the sense of what they might have been singing that shakes the foundation?
I don't know, man. Probably smoke on the water. I don't know.
My mind is just running here in the sense of him singing. It's something that
There's
results
a
in.
okay, so in that light, there's a little phrase in Ephesians, which is Pauline, and he quotes a fragment from an early Christian song, "Rise, O sleeper, and Christ's light shall shine on you." If you look up the use of Agairo and Anastasia there, it's a rare form, and it's only ever found in the story of Peter being in prison and the angel coming and touching him and waking him up.
Mm, mm,
Some have suggested that little fragment comes from an early Christian hymn that somehow the Peter story made it into yada 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 yada.
mm.
Um, I should mention I am going to put in the group a PDF of C.F.D. Moll's The Birth of the New Testament. It's one of the finest books I have ever had the pleasure of reading. I remember early on, I might have been 20, 21 years old when I read it, and it was so influential for me. And Moll was an Anglican who taught at Cambridge. Um, just an incredible scholar. Wrote just wonderful. Knew his Greek. He was the one that wrote the idiom book of the Greek New Testament. I mean, this guy knows his stuff. And I'll encourage you if you're interested in the liturgical background of the New Testament, this is the book for it. And
Oh man, thanks, man.
yeah, so I hope you'll enjoy
Yeah,
that. It's a great read.
yeah, I've got his idiom book right beside my bed.
Yeah,
You know
this
what I'm
is the book, The Birth of the New Testament.
saying? Okay,
So I'll
thank
put
you.
that PDF file in the group and yeah. Okay. Well, have fun, y'all. We'll see you next week for
Thank,
212 and following.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
God bless. Thanks.